If we ask how important social class is to London, in some ways it's just bloody obvious. Anyone who comes into London can see the massive disparities between haves and have-nots, rich and poor. We can even just divide London between east and west, or at least we could. Social class, however, is a complex concept, and in order to understand the impact of social class or the influence of social class in London, we have to do three things. We're going to talk about what social class is, we're going to talk about what social class is in the English or British popular imagination, and then we're going to talk about how that plays out in London. Social class, or just simply class, is one of the most debated concepts in the social sciences. Some, such as Karl Marx, subsequent Marxists, have argued that social class is to some degree determined by how you work. Are you an employer or an employee, part of the bourgeoisie or the proletariat? Others that followed Marx have suggested that such a reduction of class status to work, and especially to just the two classes, is overly simplistic. Max Weber, for instance, argued that we should include power and status in addition to market position when determining class status. Others, like Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, added further cultural elements like social and cultural capital. Today, social scientists often use complex measures to calculate social class, ones that take into account work, wealth, and income, cultural background, practices, and social network or networks. In America, pollsters often use education and income as a proxy for measuring class. In Britain, as so often, things are more nuanced. In 2011, in conjunction with the BBC, a team of social scientists led by Mike Savage from the London School of Economics created a class calculator that asked questions about economics, culture, and social networks that created 7 different social classes. In the British, and especially English popular imagination, however, social class is identified by everyday performance more than anything. By that I mean manners, speech, clothing, education, how you make your tea, even how you say sorry. Now, the BBC might have used complex calculations for calculating class, but the clearest indication of social class is that in Britain, 161,000 people took the test, and there was an otherwise unexplained 191% increase in demand for theatre bookings in London, after theatre attendance was determined to be a measure of high social status. So calculating social class may be complex, but knowing that it is at the heart of Englishness is not. Class, therefore, we might regard as the grammar of Englishness, even if no one knows what that is. So in this video, I'm going to talk about England specifically, because those who are in England's home empire, their original empire of Wales, Scotland, and now Northern Ireland, are often deemed to be less than upper class because of their nationality. So being Scottish is sort of looked down upon by the English elite, unless there are those Scots who sound more English, who identify more with the English. Now, this association of Englishness with upper class status in former English colonies is fascinating, but it kind of muddles the waters here, so we'll move on. So to understand the intricate relationship between social class and the English, we really have to go back to the beginning of Englishness. Now, if you overlook all the imperial adventures and the British dominance of the slave trade, and this is an erasure which seems to happen fairly efficiently for the English, the establishment, exploitation, and reproduction of a class system is England's original sin. For example, if American sport was largely divided by racial barriers, up until the early 1960s, the popular sport of cricket had strict class divisions between amateur players called gentlemen and professionals called players. Social distances between the two were created by having groups arrive on the field through different gates, listing professionals' initials after their surname and gentlemen's before, and having separate changing rooms. Racial divisions, of course, would come later, but what I'm trying to suggest is that original division was between working classes and the upper classes. And these stains of social class on Englishness are openly, if silently, celebrated. All around England stand monuments to and of the aristocracy. Henry VIII's rampant wife-killing, let alone his flagrant later life disregard for hygiene, would not make him a popular contemporary figure, although Tudor house intrigue would certainly have made for great clickbait. Nonetheless, Greenwich and Hampton Court palaces remain heavily promoted tourist attractions. Celebrations of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert always overlook the hungry 1840s and the complete political marginalization of women and the poor. Stately homes are a matter of national pride, rather than a place of remembrance for those who toiled on their soil. Shows like Downton Abbey, Victoria, and The Crown sell a particular sense of Englishness around the world. The monarchy remains popular in England and has established itself as part of the charm of cool Britannia. Aristocratic patterns of land ownership continue to dominate the country. A third of all land in the UK and around half of all rural land is in aristocratic hands. That's an awkward sentence. In London, the Crown, the Church, and 5 aristocratic estates own over 1,000 acres of prime central London real estate. To be sure, as with all things, the English are immensely cynical about the upper classes, and there's regular disquiet about the reproduction of elite rule. Nonetheless, it feels impossible to separate aristocratic rule and class divisions from Englishness. It's not for nothing that migrants paying for British citizenship are forced to learn the kings and queens as part of the long and illustrious history section of the Life in the UK test necessary to stay in the country. Not that I'm bitter about that. Speaking of proper manners remains commonplace, even among the commoners. Now, this great English class system has pre-capitalist roots in feudal land ownership that, without a revolutionary disposition of the nobility, continues to strongly influence both English attitudes and its economy. As the pre-capitalist land-owning English elite increased its wealth through investments in the expansion of the empire, including, vitally, the slave trade, and the Georgian-era enclosure of agricultural land forced the landless masses to move to cities in search of work, properly capitalist class divides emerged. These divides produce a mass of labouring humanity, an increasingly visible middle class, and an aristocracy reluctantly transitioning its privilege from land ownership, in which you didn't have to work, you're too gentle to work, gentlemen, to trade and to commerce. People who worked, you see, were often seen as common, even if you were a doctor or a lawyer. City life only deepened class divides. But identifying class positions was not as easy as it might have been in the countryside, where one's position in the household made social standing very clear. On city streets, the casual observer had less opportunity to size up the work and the wealth of those they encountered. Instead, it was appearance and expression that was their only guide. A strong link developed between cleanliness and refinement and social class. Sometimes, keeping up appearances was a matter of life or death, or at least keeping a roof over your head and getting your daily bread. For those scraping by on Victorian London's low-wage economy, credit was a daily necessity. Lenders had no possibility of conducting credit checks, and most of the poor had no property to act as security. Lenders, often landlords or local shops, were forced to make their decision to offer credit based on what was in front of them, appearance and expression. In English, class. Thus, looking like you had wealth was a form of capital in itself, what Bourdieu would now call cultural capital. In a wonderfully English convolution, this meant that seeming to have a middle-class disposition was as important as having middle-class money. A strange economy of appearance emerged, where appearing to have wealth required you to spend money, which itself required access to credit, and the cycle went again. The historian Jerry White argues that this fragile credit nexus involved, at some point in their lives, almost the whole population of London, and involved them in the threat of ruin, and for a substantial minority, in ruin itself. Such pressure created unique subcultures in Victorian London. Debtors could not be arrested on Sundays, you see, or within their own house, unless bailiffs were invited or came through an open door window. Committed debtors could therefore hold themselves up for 6 days a week, if they could afford to, and leave the house 1 day a week, as what they called Sunday men. It is perhaps this obsession with keeping up appearances, a favourite English phrase, that led social anthropologist Kate Fox to claim that class in England has nothing to do with money and very little to do with occupation. Instead, Fox suggests, linguistic class codes, as part of larger cultural expressions, are the primary signifier of class status in England. Saying sorry rather than pardon is a class act, as is choosing between grey track pants or red trousers. In London, however, a city thrown together by those escaping traditional binds and attempting to recalibrate them in a different context, cultural class customs are difficult to police. Indeed, just as the English have spread across the Commonwealth in search of new lives, escaping class bounds is all part of London's mythology. And yet, the city's elegance and its inequities have been built on class divides and traditions. Indeed, the city is literally divided by class. From the 17th century, power and privilege began to accumulate in the West around Westminster, particularly after the Great Fire of 1666. With royalty, both great and gluttonous, came the estates that lie under today's West End. In turn, the presence of these estates attracted prestige and wealth on their green fringes. London's wealth spread out from Westminster and the Old City, creating enclaves of wealth and fine Georgian squares in Marylebone and in Bloomsbury. On the other side of the city, the naturally easterly position of the docks led to precarious seafaring communities forming in eastern locations such as Bermondsey, Limehouse, Rotherhithe, and Wapping. Factories developed, and, with London's winds typically coming from the west, wealthier Westerners were able to avoid the worst of the odours of the Industrial Revolution. Newcomers, from the Huguenots to the Irish, were forced to cram themselves into existing communities outside of the eastern boundaries of the city. The working class East Enders, or Cockneys, that are part of the legend of the city emerged. The Cockney reputation for Londoners was established during the Great Victorian Migration. At this time, as historian Jerry White asserts, migration to the city, particularly of unmarried young women, meant that by the mid 19th century, having two London grandparents would have been inherently improbable. And yet, although Victorian newcomers tended to settle on the greener edges of London, often in close proximity to the railway station they arrived from, an increasingly compacted section of the East End had Londoners of longer lineage. This was especially true of Bethnal Green, where the 1851 census showed that 82% of residents were London born, compared to 62% in London as a whole. For an indigenous community, though, their roots were rather recent. This most London of districts was simply a more entrenched migrant community. Bethnal Green was originally an overspill of the 18th century Huguenot silk weaving community, eventually developing what we've come to know as the Cockney dialect. It does not take long to become a Londoner. And while these class divides have been disrupted and increasingly replaced by an inner-outer divide, the rich inner city and the poorer outer suburbs, even a casual visitor to London can notice distinct differences between the glamour of the West and the grit of the East. These traditions, these class traditions, are built into the story that London sells to the world, so that tourists coming to London often seek to play out posh fantasies when staying at places like the Savoy and taking afternoon tea at Harrods. While these establishments might outwardly embrace the class snobbery their customers are paying to experience, on the production side, class structures are established through the lopsided struggle between the hotel's elite owners and their marginalized migrant workers. So it's in these hotels that we see the strongest and perhaps most bizarre expression of English upperclassness in London. The owners aren't from England. The customers paying to experience English class snobbery aren't from England. The workers aren't from England. And yet the whole class relation is in some way English. Now, Marx would have seen all of this social and cultural stuff as bourgeoisie rubbish and a mere symptom of economic position. A business owner with more popular cultural tastes and no friends is still in a position to exploit his employees. So is class still important in London? At first glance, of course it is. London has massive and growing disparities in income and wealth. A visitor to central London cannot but be struck by homeless populations outside high-end shops, and increasingly, neighbourhoods are being defined by poverty and wealth beyond this mere east-west divide. Culturally, however, London is moving away from traditional English class representations. For many Londoners, how you drink your tea or apologise is a matter of nationality and language, not class. To be sure, pockets of old wealth and old class cultures remain in places like Mayfair and Hampstead. There's still such a thing as a Chelsea set, as seen in the reality TV show Made in Chelsea. Cockney, or Cockney-esque Londoners, are still part of the fabric of the city, although it's symbolic that the working class equivalent of Made in Chelsea is the only way of Essex being outside of the boundaries of London. Likewise, today's distinctively London working class accent is called Jafrakan, a combination of Caribbean, Asian, and Cockney dialects. And so, the more obvious class positions in post-industrial London are filled by immigrants. The elite, often from Gulf states or Russia, flaunt their wealth in clubs and in the streets, but they're still the elite. Domestic service workers are more likely to be women from the Philippines rather than the English countryside, but their relationship to their masters is the same as it was 150 years ago. Just as London is a city of capitalism, it's a city of class, no matter how you read it.